While the group of foreign beings were escorted out of the room, Vizier Haedix focused his attention on the mood of those around him. It became immediately obvious to him that arranging for the foreigners to be presented to the kingdom's leadership was the correct decision. While many of the voices he could hear seemed to favor isolating Azjol-Nerub from the eastern kingdoms, a large portion of the leadership was interested in the potential benefits that could be gained from the new lands. Haedix knew without a doubt that if the Order had not gone to significant lengths to direct key members of the leadership toward a more outward-looking policy, then that portion would be substantially smaller. As it was, this was a favorable start, and Haedix was confident that the kingdom would reach the conclusion that it was in its best interest to establish a presence in the eastern kingdoms. Haedix glanced toward one of the viziers from the Technological Research Division and gave him a nearly imperceptible nod once he caught their attention. It wouldn't do for Haedix to publicly push for his agenda given his connection to the initiates responsible for discovering the Eastern Kingdoms in the first place if he wanted to avoid attracting unwanted attention. And he very much did want to avoid that. Therefore, Haedix had convinced a vizier that was seemingly unrelated to himself to push his agenda for him. Vizier Creel visibly flinched when Haedix nodded at him, but he still obediently moved to carry out the nonverbal command. "Under King Kukurak," said Vizier Creel, silencing the crowd as everyone turned their attention to him. "I believe I speak for my colleagues in the Technological Research Division when I say that it is in the best interest of the Kingdom of Azjol-Nerub to establish a diplomatic presence in the Eastern Kingdoms and learn what we can from its natives. The Arcane Research Division supports this as well for the potential it has in expanding our magical knowledge base by introducing new factors and insights." Vizier Sears agreed, pleasantly surprising Haedix because she needed no prompting on his part to do so. Most likely due to her division anticipating the benefits of a relationship with the surface in regards to the new arcane-aligned reagents collected from the Lathala woodlands and hoping for more. Haedix listened carefully to the surrounding responses. "We stand to gain much knowledge from these new lands. I wonder if there are any reagents in the Eastern Kingdoms that could be used to create a superior healing potion. We should prioritize studying the technology of these gnomes. It would be wise for the kingdom to keep a close eye on these lands for potential threats." Similar voices echoed throughout the room, with most being positive or at least neutral with few outright dissenting against it. The response was more positive than Haedix had expected, although he could tell that there were many who held different opinions and were not speaking up. The natural curiosity of the viziers and the desire of the weavers for trading goods that would benefit their various crafts pushed against their insular nature. Ridiculous. All discussion in the room was immediately silenced by the deep voice of a Spider Lord coming from the Nazenak scrying crystal. "Why should our kingdom associate itself with lesser creatures? What could they possibly have to offer us? Are our viziers so inept that they need to learn from foreigners? Are we so incompetent that we need the help of others to acquire the materials that this kingdom needs?" said Under King Anu Besit derisively. Many who were previously quiet started to mutter in support of the Underking. "If we allow those foreigners to return to the Eastern Kingdoms, then our lands will soon be crawling with outsiders whether we want it or not. We should kill these creatures and destroy their transport before it is too late." Haedix didn't bother holding back a scoff. It was obvious to everyone that Nazenak would benefit the least out of all the present cities from diplomatic ties with the Eastern Kingdoms, given the city's focus on producing warriors over viziers or weavers. The Spider Lord's objections more likely stemmed more from that fact rather than an actual ideological opposition. Haedix wasn't the only one who could pick up on this fact, and the Underking would almost certainly face pushback. Sure enough, mocking laughter echoed from the Ankilla scrying crystal as soon as Underking Anu Besit finished speaking. "Are you truly so scared, Anu Besit?" said Underking Neferset, his voice filled with mockery. "Are your warriors so incapable of handling a few lesser creatures exploring our lands that you believe we should hide like newly born hatchlings? It's obvious to everyone that the kingdom would be better off learning more about these new lands rather than hiding like cowards." Neferset was no less self-interested than Anu Besit given the relatively large focus his city put on creating capable viziers. Ankilla stood to benefit greatly from the new knowledge that they could potentially learn. "Who are you calling a coward, Neferset? I doubt you would be so brave if you were speaking to me in person." "I have better things to do than fight with a fool," said Underking Neferset with a scoff. "We would be better off discussing the composition of the diplomatic party that we'll be sending to the Eastern Kingdoms." You act as if we have already made a decision, rebuked Under-King Kukurak. I, for one, still have reservations on the matter. Haedix had done his best to direct Under-King Kukurak to a more outward-looking policy, but his success was severely hampered by the Order's relatively light presence in Kilakuk. Kukurak was steadily warming up to the idea of increased interaction with outsiders due to the benefits that trading with the Tuskar had brought to his city, but centuries of belief were difficult to overcome. I agree with Under-King Nasfaset, said Queen Melrose as one of her skitterers delivered a lobster to her grasp. We have much to gain from studying these new races and the trading goods that the human expressed interest in are easily acquired. The kingdom produces plenty of ore and there is no shortage of low-grade silk that we could trade for valuable goods. After all, it's only the higher-grade magical silks that we would need to restrict from trading. The weavers were able to produce many high-grade silks with magical silks with fantastical properties that the kingdom would not want in the hands of outsiders. Haedix noted that many of the weavers he could see relaxed slightly at the words of Queen Melrose. Many of them were extremely protective of their more powerful silks, and would naturally oppose trading them away to outsiders. The discussion continued on like that for a while, with several important leaders arguing for their positions on either side of the matter. Haedix was gratified to see that Vizier Creel succeeded in pushing the narrative toward establishing diplomatic contact by constantly mentioning the benefits of doing so whenever someone spoke against it. Vizier Silvos also spoke in favor on occasion, but he remained quiet for the most part. There is also the matter of the prophesied tide of death, said the aged voice of Elder Nadox, one of the most politically powerful viziers and Azjol-Nerub and trusted advisor to High King Anubarak. It would greatly increase the security of our kingdom if our people were able to spread to another continent. At the vizier's words, the discussion suddenly stopped and Haedix could feel himself want to chuckle with mirth. While Nadox was not a member of the Order, his apprentice, Sirixit, was, and he had done everything he could to convince the Elder that the kingdom needed to spread to the Eastern Kingdoms if it wanted to survive. It seems that Tixit's efforts have paid off, Haedix thought with amusement. Nobody wanted to speak against the Elder, due both to the political power he wielded and their unease over the unknown calamity that many of the kingdom's seers could sense approaching. Hearing Elder Nadox tell them that their kingdom would be significantly safer if they expanded to another continent was a great source of discomfort for most of them. Just as the silence was beginning to grow awkward, a voice that nearly every leader in the kingdom would recognize carried across the room. Enough, said High King Anubarak in a tone that brooked no argument. The kingdom of Azjol-Nerub will send a diplomatic party to join the outsiders as they return to the Eastern Kingdoms. This team must be capable of establishing a permanent portal connection between the kingdom and these new lands if we decide it is in our best interests to do so. Matters of trade will be handled on a case-by-case basis. We will now move the discussion to the details and composition of this diplomatic party. With that, the discussion on whether or not the kingdom should interact with the Eastern Kingdoms was brought to an end. Although the various cities of the kingdom had a large amount of autonomy, none of them would dare to directly contradict the orders of the High King on such a serious matter. Haedix was unsurprised that the High King had chosen to step in. While the kingdom was extremely isolationist, it was obviously in their interest to have some amount of contact with these newly discovered lands, even if only to keep an eye on them. Though, the nature and the degree of that contact was still up for negotiation. It was likely that the High King wished for the diplomatic party to gather additional information about the Eastern Kingdoms so that he could make a more informed decision at a later date. There were many short-sighted fools who would prefer to simply kill all the outsiders, destroy their ship, and never worry about them again, but fortunately, Anubarak was a fairly competent ruler. The discussion was quiet for several more moments before the crowd slowly started to argue over who would be sent with the group. Each of the cities wanted to send its own people so that they could push their respective cities' agendas. Haedix spent a while listening and decided to step forward after Under-King Anubesit shamelessly proposed to send one of his direct subordinates with the diplomatic party he previously spoke out against. The Order had decided that it would be best if he was the one who traveled to the Eastern Kingdoms so that he could begin scouting these new lands for the influence of the old ones. After all, his direct relationship with the initiate behind the discovery of the Eastern Kingdoms made it easy to justify his inclusion in the diplomatic party. Leaders of the Kingdom of Azjol-Nerub, I am Vizier Haedix of Kilahuk's Surface Research Division, he said, attracting the attention of everybody listening to himself. Haedix gestured to Krivax with one of his arms and watched him tense as the crowd turned their attention to him. "I'm the mentor of the one who was directly responsible for discovering these new lands, Initiate Krivax. I would like to put forward myself, Initiate Krivax, and Neophyte Masruk to be sent as members of this diplomatic party due to our experience in dealing with races of the surface." "I could understand, Vizier Haedix," said Underking Neferset, with an edge of skepticism. "I could even perhaps understand sending your initiate, as young as he may be. But why should we send a neophyte with this expedition?" "Because the two of them are practically inseparable and I don't want to deal with the brats whining if I try to split them apart." Not only had Initiate Krivax shown himself to possess a useful talent for diplomacy with the surface, but Haedix was loath to leave the talented Initiate in the hands of Marlas. As such, it was best to bring the Initiate along to the Eastern Kingdoms instead of leaving him behind and allowing his potential to be squandered. Or worse. "Neophyte Masruk has spent more time than most on the surface," said Vizier Haedix. "He has shown himself to be competent at communicating with the other races and will be a useful asset. He has also fought with and against the surface races, observing how they fight in great detail, something which I believe will be very important when studying these foreigners in their own lands." It was not the strongest of justifications on his part, but it was good enough that nobody cared to fight him over it. The discussion went on for quite some time and was made more difficult by the limited amount of space on the foreigners' wooden ship, but they were eventually able to agree on the composition of the diplomatic party. Inkilla would send a vizier who was both proficient in technologies and experienced in creating permanent portals. Azjol-Nerub would send weavers who were highly knowledgeable about the kingdom's material needs and could assist in any potential trade negotiations. Nasinak would provide the warriors that would both offer protection to the rest of the envoys and evaluate these new lands for potential threats. Kilahuk would send Vizier Haedix to handle any necessary diplomatic negotiations, and he would be accompanied by Initiate Krivax and Neophyte Masruk. At one point, the discussion devolved into a heated argument on the merits of sending a Spider Lord to act as head of the party's protection detail, with many pointing out that the outsider's ship was not large enough to comfortably transport one. Azjol-Nerub might not have its own maritime tradition, but the viziers were smart enough to understand that a Spider Lord would be forced to stay on the deck and would face severe difficulties during long sea travel. However, many thought sending a Spider Lord would be essential as both protection and a show of force to the surface races. Eventually, it was decided that a Spider Lord would be sent after some of the viziers from Inkilla proposed that the Spider Lord be fastened to the ship with adhesive waterproof silk and put to sleep with a potion to stave away boredom. There were a few more things that they needed to discuss after they reached an agreement on the diplomatic party's composition, but they eventually finished and the meeting was ended by High King Anubarak. After giving an order for the members of the diplomatic party to prepare for their journey to the Eastern Kingdoms, the scrying crystal for Azjol-Nerub went dark and the other two crystals soon followed. Haedix couldn't help but sigh in relief. The meeting had gone as expected and the results were as favorable as he could reasonably hope for. Turning his attention to Initiate Krivax, Haedix could see that the Initiate was still filled with tension, but he was slowly relaxing. "We're not done yet, Initiate," thought Haedix with no small amount of humor. "You're about to become the center of the crowd's attention for the second time today. As you have heard, the High King has decided to establish a diplomatic relationship with the Eastern Kingdoms," said Underking Kukrak to the city's leadership. "There is no doubt that this will bring great change to this kingdom, and you all will be responsible for guiding our people through this. I am sure you all have much to think about. If nobody has anything else to discuss, then you are all dismissed. I will send a messenger to inform the outsiders of our decision. In fact, there is something further that I would like to discuss," said Haedix, just as everyone was preparing to leave the room. "I wish to take this opportunity to ask a favor of Queen Melrose." "Oh? What favor is it that you wish to ask me?" asked the Queen, her tone one of curiosity. Her bulbous abdomen swayed as she directed her attention away from the skitterers that were crawling along her body to deliver food to her mandibles and turned that attention to Haedix. "I would ask that you elevate Initiate Krivax to the Vizier caste before he is sent to the Eastern Kingdoms, Queen Melrose." Haedix could see from the corner of his vision that Initiate Krivax had completely stopped moving after processing what was just said. The room was silent for only a short, surprised moment before one of the viziers loudly objected to the proposal. "That is a ridiculous proposition. That initiate is barely more than a hatchling. How could you believe him worthy of such an honor? None of the other viziers started yelling, but it was obvious that they did not approve of the proposition. The warriors and weavers watched with interest but were otherwise uninvested in the matter. It's simple really, Haedix said coldly, turning his gaze to the noisy vizier. Initiate Krivax has contributed more to this kingdom in his short tenure as an initiate and my student by discovering the Eastern Kingdoms than many of those in this room will contribute in their entire lives. That was enough to cause many of the viziers to break out into angry condemnations, but their opinions were irrelevant, so Haedix simply ignored them and turned his attention back to the Queen. Queen Melrose was the one who had the final say over who was and was not elevated to a higher caste in the city of Kilahuk. The only reason that the circle of viziers was usually able to control which of their members were elevated was because the Queen was incredibly difficult to actually meet with. Even if you did meet her, the situation usually did not allow for requests to be made of her, but Haedix felt that this situation was different. Not only was it true that the initiate in question had contributed greatly to the kingdom, but he was also about to be sent on an extremely important mission. Haedix was not foolish enough to miss this opportunity to increase the value of an initiate that was so closely tied to himself, especially given the plans that he had for the young mage. "How bold of you," said Queen Melrose with a chuckle. "Do you truly believe your initiate is worthy of me spending the effort to elevate him?" "I do," Vizier Haedix said without hesitation. "And you, initiate?" asked Queen Melrose after a short pause. "Do you believe you are ready to become a vizier?" The question seemed to startle Initiate Krivax out of whatever daze he was in. "Yes, Queen Melrose," said Initiate Krivax. "I am ready to become a vizier and serve the kingdom to the best of my ability." He's overdoing it a little, but it was still a good enough answer, I suppose, thought Haedix. He could tell that Queen Melrose seemed to think so as well. "Very well," said Queen Melrose, waving her hand dismissively. "I suppose it is no great burden, and it's not every day that an initiate discovers a whole new continent. Bring him to me tomorrow. The process is not a quick one and I will need to begin soon if you do not wish to delay the expedition." With that said, the Queen moved to leave without further comment, her gaggle of skitterer attendants hot on her heels or even under her bloated abdomen in an attempt to help lessen her load. "If there is nothing else, then you are all dismissed," said Underking Kukarak. This time, nobody interrupted him and everyone started to make their way out of the room while discussing the implications of everything that had happened during the meeting. Initiate Krivax moved to leave as well, likely to meet with the outsiders and his warrior friend, before Haedix stopped him by placing an arm on the initiate's shoulder. "Vizier Haedix, is there something further that you need from me?" "Yes, there is," said Haedix, his amusement growing as he watched the young mage's expression grow increasingly nervous. "The outsiders will have to wait. I have something important to show you." "What is it, Vizier Haedix?" asked Initiate Krivax, trying and failing to hide his apprehension. "You'll see when we reach there," Haedix said simply as he turned and began walking towards the room's exit. "Follow me." After a few hesitant moments, Haedix heard the skittering footsteps of the initiate and he allowed his mind to wander as he thought about the conversation he was about to have with the young one. When he first decided to arrange for Initiate Krivax to be designated to his division, he did so because of the initiate's drive and talent. As he watched the young mage devote all of his free time and energy to learning magic, Haedix had even started to think it would be a good idea to induct the initiate into the order after a few decades due to his constant drive to learn and improve. However, none of his plans could have foreseen what Initiate Krivax had accomplished over such a short time. When Haedix allowed him to travel to the surface with the intention of interacting with the surface races, he had thought nothing of importance would come of it. How wrong he was. Now things had changed, and it was in his best interests for Initiate Krivax to learn about the Order before they left for the Eastern Kingdoms. There was some amount of risk, given that Initiate Krivax was now too well known to be disposed of discreetly if he reacted poorly. Unfortunately, there were many who were fanatically loyal to the kingdom and did not approve once they learned that there was a secret organization of viziers that held significant political power behind the scenes. He was also young, inexperienced in many things, and highly idealistic, all traits that usually were not usually a great fit for the Order. Still, Haedix believed that he had a good understanding of Initiate Krivax by now, and he knew how to pluck the right threads to get what he wanted. Krivax did his best to shake off the residual discomfort that came with being teleported. After the meeting, Vizier Hadix had ominously told him that he had something important to tell him and ordered Krivax to follow him. The moment the two of them had reached a secure location without any witnesses, the Vizier had abruptly teleported them both to an unknown location and Krivax had no idea what was happening. As soon as Krivax managed to find his bearings, he quickly took a look at his surroundings, hoping he would be able to figure out where he was. He quickly realized that Vizier Hadix had taken him to an isolated cavern that was illuminated only by bioluminescent mushrooms that were growing on the cavern walls. No matter how hard he looked, Krivax couldn't see any exits or entrances to the cavern, nor could he see any other Nerubians aside from the Vizier who was patiently waiting for him to finish taking in his new environment. Krivax looked down at the teleportation locus that was under his feet and tried his best to read the various arcane glyphs that formed it. Despite Vizier Hadix making it seem otherwise, long-distance teleportation was not an easy magic that any mage could use without difficulty. The locus, as far as Krivax could tell, served to make it easier for authorized mages to teleport into the cavern while simultaneously denying the spatial magic of those who were unauthorized. Unfortunately, Krivax was not knowledgeable enough about arcane glyphs to understand how the locus decided who was and was not authorized, so he decided to turn his attention back to the rest of his surroundings. The two of them were standing on a platform that was suspended in the air by long strands of silk attached to the walls and ceiling, and in front of them was a silk bridge that led to a truly massive ziggurat that reached from the base of the cavern to its roof. Krivax was used to ziggurats being centers of activity as Nerubians constantly entered and exited them as they went about their business, so to see one so devoid of life was ominous and unsettling. Standing completely still on both sides of the bridge were a pair of obsidian destroyers, similar to the ones he had seen earlier in the day. While they might seem like mere statues, Krivax knew that they would have killed him in an instant if he had come here without permission. The things gave him the creeps since Krivax was well aware that they were Titan-forged Tol'vir that the Nerubians enslaved millennia ago when they first moved into the lands that would become Northrend, turning them into killing machines under their control. I really hope Hadix didn't bring me here in order to get rid of me. This place gives me the creeps. Vizier Hadix, what is this place? Krivax asked nervously, praying that his mentor was not about to break into some kind of villainous monologue. This place, Initiate, is the headquarters for the Order of Kal'jet, said Vizier Hadix, his voice more solemn than Krivax had ever heard before. A secret organization of viziers to which I belong and one which I brought you here to learn about. What is the Order of Kal'jet, Vizier? Krivax asked curiously, hoping that he wasn't about to be forcibly inducted into some kind of cult. Follow me, said Vizier Hadix as he turned and began making his way across the bridge into the ziggurat. I will explain everything to you soon enough. Krivax couldn't help but ask another question as he hurried to follow the Vizier. If this ziggurat belongs to the Order of Kal'jet, then where is everybody? I informed the Order of our arrival ahead of time. You are not yet authorized to know the identities of the Order's members, Vizier Hadix said matter-of-factly. Many of them are still here, of course, but you will not see them until later. That really doesn't ease my worries that I'm about to be inducted into a cult, Krivax thought gloomily. The distance between the platform with the teleportation locus and the ziggurat was not very far, so it didn't take very long before they were walking through the entrance. A part of him was surprised to see that the ziggurat was not noticeably different from any of the other ziggurats he had entered before, aside from its emptiness. One would think that the headquarters of some kind of secret organization would be a bit more distinctive. That impression quickly changed once they exited the hallway and entered the ziggurat's first chamber. Krivax could see that there were many hallways connected to the room that were each visibly indistinguishable from one another. The room itself was empty of any decorations or adornments aside from a few enchanted braziers placed in its corners, but in its center was an ornate plinth that supported a crucible that was filled with some kind of pitch-black liquid. Krivax didn't understand why, but something about the liquid disquieted him even from across the room. That feeling only grew as he reluctantly followed Vizier Hadix when he walked straight to the center of the room. Once he got close enough that the crucible was within touching distance, Krivax noticed that both the plinth and the crucible were covered in a dense array of arcane glyphs. After opening up his magical senses, Krivax was astonished to discover the powerful wards that were connected to the objects. However, As powerful as these wards were, it was the pitch-black liquid that drew his full attention. Directing his magical senses to the liquid made Krivax feel as if he was suddenly looking over a dark unending abyss while being utterly certain that something he could not see was looking back in turn. The longer he looked, the more he felt as if could hear the sound of whispering voices and see flickers of movement in the corner of his vision. Once he noticed feelings of doubt, despair, and panic growing inside of him, Krivax hurriedly turned his attention away from the dark liquid. "Vizier Haedix, what is this?" asked Krivax, struggling to keep his internal panic out of his voice. "This is something that I asked the Order to arrange for us," Vizier Haedix said calmly. "It is a sort of tradition for those who first learn of the Order to witness a demonstration of what this liquid is capable of." Without further comment, Vizier Haedix reached into one of his spatial bags and pulled out a still-living lobster, and then casually threw it into the crucible. Living creatures were much more difficult to spatially store than objects, but magically storing a non-sapient lobster with such a simple soul was well within the vizier's ability. Krivax watched with trepidation as the liquid seemed to reach out to grab the lobster as it approached. The crucible was obviously not very deep given that the crustacean was not fully submerged, but that only made it easier for him to look on in horror as the shellfish slowly mutated. At first, parts of its previously red shell became varying shades of purple while others morphed into some kind of strange fleshy substance. After a while, small wandering eyes and tiny mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth could be seen growing randomly across its body. By the time the mutated lobster began to grow small twisting tentacles, it was obvious to Krivax that he was looking at a crucible filled with some kind of liquid void. He was already aware that the void was nothing good for the vast majority of living creatures, but this was significantly more disturbing than he had expected. Krivax tore his gaze from the grotesque display once the tiny mouths began to scream in incoherent anguish. Vizier Haedix must have thought that he had seen enough, or maybe it was just too dangerous to continue, because he swiftly telekinetically lifted the mutated lobster out of the crucible and threw it onto the ground. For a moment, the thing seemed as if it were about to start running at them before the vizier began burning it with a stream of arcane fire until nothing but ash remained. "What you just witnessed was the effect that concentrated void energies have on a living creature," said Vizier Haedix grimly as he ended the stream of fire. "The void is a malevolent force that seeks to corrupt all living creatures unfortunate enough to enter its grasp. It is the duty of the Order of Kal'tsit to prevent the malignant void from spreading its poisonous influence to Nerebian society by any means necessary." Krivax gave himself a moment to recover from the very disturbing example of the void's corruptive powers, something he was aware of before but was quite another thing entirely to see in person. His mentor said nothing as he composed himself and asked the first question that came to mind. "If that is the goal of the Order, then why is it so secret?" asked Krivax, confused. Considering what he knew already and especially after watching a display like that, he felt like the void was something that everyone should know about. Who wouldn't support the suppression of something so obviously evil? "You said that the Order of Kal'tsit was a secret organization of viziers. Why don't you have any Queen or Spider Lord members in the Order?" "Good questions, Initiate," Vizier Haedix said approvingly. "Before I answer them, you must learn about the history of the Order's creation. The beginning of that story starts with a Nerebian by the name of Kal'tsit, who was a vizier that lived during the times of the Second Nerebian-Vrukul War." As he spoke, the vizier turned and started to make his way to one of the many seemingly identical hallways connected to the room. Once they entered the hallway, it became immediately obvious to Krivax why this was where the vizier had chosen to lead him. All along the walls of the hallway was a colorful, intricately woven mural made from high-grade Nerebian silk that depicted what Krivax assumed were historical scenes. The very first scene depicted by the mural was not an army of Nerebians doing battle with the Vrukul as he had expected, but instead showed the Nerebians invading what he was sure was Uldaar. "Do you remember from your studies how the Second Nerebian-Vrukul War began, and the events of the war that preceded it, Initiate?" asked Vizier Haedix. "Yes, Vizier, it was the second major conflict Azjol Nereb engaged in with the Vrukuls that began when we attempted to invade a place of forbidden knowledge and artifacts," said Krivax, repeating what he had read from the Circle's historical records. "Years after our loss during the First War, High King Anub-Sekith invaded the facility with the intention of acquiring secrets and relics that could aid our people against the Vrukul. That is what the records say, but it is not the entire truth," said Vizier Haedix as he continued walking down the long hallway at a steady pace. Soon the scene changed to an image of what Krivax recognized to be a portrayal of Titan-forged creatures slaughtering the Nerubians as they attempted to free an imprisoned Yogg-Saron. Even the simple image of the old god was disturbing to look upon. Most of what the records say is true, but the High King's motives are different from what you know, said Vizier Haedix solemnly as he gestured towards the mural. The facility was more than just a place of forbidden knowledge and artifacts. It was a prison, and the High King invaded that prison with the goal of releasing its only prisoner, one of the old gods. Old gods? The cruel and destructive beings that our people used to worship? I thought they were a myth, Krivax said, feigning surprise as best he could as he followed behind the vizier. Unfortunately, they are all too real. In the past, worship of these beings pervaded every aspect of our society, and it was one of them who directed the High King to the prison, said Vizier Haedix. The murals gradually turned into scenes of the Vrukal defeating the Nerubians during the Second War until they were pushed all the way to the city of Azjol-Nerub. The scenes depicted made it clear that the devastation that the Nerubians faced back then was far more significant than what was publicly recorded. The Vrukal truly pushed them to the edge of calamity. Vizier Kalchut was a trusted advisor to the High King, and he was forced to watch helplessly as Anub-Zikith was manipulated by the influence of the old god into making a series of irrational decisions that brought the kingdom to near ruin, said Vizier Haedix. Krivax watched with interest as the mural began to show images of a vizier arguing with a spider lord, only to grow increasingly desperate as his advice went unheeded. Soon enough, Krivax was looking at the somber depiction of the vizier looking miserable as he stood over the corpse of the spider lord. After losing the Second War, Anub-Zikith was overthrown and killed, an event which devastated Vizier Kalchut. Not only was Kalchut a trusted advisor to Anub-Zikith, but they were also lifelong friends, said Vizier Haedix, his tone uncharacteristically sympathetic. The two of them had been born together, raised together, and had a relationship not unlike the one you share with your warrior friend. Krivax felt a sudden pang of sympathy for Vizier Kalchut. Just imagining being helpless as the void twisted Masruk into a creature unlike himself made him feel a sense of overwhelming dread. While the kingdom's new leadership was content to blame Anub-Zikith for the failure of the war, Vizier Kalchut was wise enough to see where the blame truly laid, said Vizier Haedix with unusual fervor. Vizier Kalchut realized that it would be madness and folly if our people continued to follow the old god's will, and sought to put an end to it. It would be the work of many millennia, but he and those he taught would see it done. The mural went on to show a gathering of viziers working in the shadows, undermining the old god's influence among the Nerubians for thousands of years through countless methods while helping the kingdom rebuild, never showing themselves fully but always acting, waiting for the perfect chance to fully overthrow their gods. They did their best to lead Azjol-Nerub into a more enlightened age where they alone decided their own destiny. Kalchut eventually died, but those he taught continued his work long after his passing, said Vizier Haedix, his voice becoming increasingly passionate as he told the story. These enlightened few would build the foundation of the organization that would eventually be known as the Order of Kalchut. Vizier Haedix, what are those? Asked Krivax, pointing towards a creature on the mural that he did not recognize. They seemed to be some kind of insectoid creatures, yet distinctly different from the Nerubians. It was hard to tell for certain, but it looked as if the members of the order were hiding from them. It is not well known now, but prior to the Sundering our kingdom was in contact with two other kingdoms similar to our own, said Vizier Haedix with distaste after he saw what Krivax was pointing towards. Ahn'Qiraj and Mantifes were kingdoms much like our own that also worshipped the old gods. Their influence made it much more difficult for the order to free our people, but fortunately, that changed with the Great Sundering. Krivax remembered Ahn'Qiraj and Mantifes from his meta-knowledge, but he had not known that Azjol-Nerub had been in contact with them up until the Sundering. Soon the scenes on the mural changed to a vivid depiction of the Great Sundering, a calamity that shattered the earth and reshaped the world. Krivax idly mused that the vizier had a great sense of dramatic timing. After Azjol-Nerub lost contact with its sister kingdoms, the order continued its efforts to free our people from the old gods, said Vizier Haedix. Krivax could tell that the story must be reaching its completion given that they had nearly reached the end of the hallway. In the immediate chaos of the years following the disaster, the order struck hard and fast to remove the strongest supporters of the old gods and replaced them with their own. It took several more millennia, but we were eventually able to destroy or seal away any sign of the old gods, and nearly completely remove all memory of them from our society. Krivax could feel a growing sense of awe as they reached the end of the mural and stepped through the hallway into the next room, revealing a library significantly larger than the circle of viziers back home. Krivax looked upon rows of books and the few skitterers that were attending the library, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of secrets were contained in such a place. The Order has been forced to heavily rewrite Azjol-Nerub's history in our endless battle to keep our people's fate out of the hands of malicious gods, said Vizier Haedix with a hint of regret. However, his expression soon turned to one of pride. This library not only holds all of the knowledge that the Order has accumulated since its creation, but it also holds the full and uncensored version of the history of our people. Krivax watched for several moments as the vizier seemed to lose himself to his thoughts while gazing at the library before he decided that he should say something to continue the conversation. "That's amazing, Vizier Haedix," said Krivax genuinely. It was good that the Order had made efforts to preserve the history that it was rewriting. "It is," said Vizier Haedix, turning his attention back to Krivax. "Even after our success, the Order of Kalchut has continued to work from the shadows to prevent the old gods from ever again gaining control of our people. You asked me why our Order acts in secret and why we recruit only from the Vizier caste. I will answer both now that you have an understanding of our history." Krivax waited patiently as the vizier took a moment to gather his thoughts before answering the questions. "Our decision to act in secret was, at first, a method through which the Order protected itself from the servants of the old gods," said Vizier Haedix. "Once the vast majority of their influence was excised from Azjol-Nerub, we decided to keep our efforts secret due to the subtle and insidious nature of the Void, as well as the speed at which it can spread its corruption. The Order believes that if the Void was publicly known, then there would be many who intentionally seek it out, whether due to curiosity or a simple lust for power. This would allow for Void cults to more easily grow in our society without our knowledge." That made some amount of sense to Krivax. He knew from his meta-knowledge that the cults of old gods could quickly spread out of control given the success of the Twilight's Hammer. He faintly remembered that there was a bishop or something of the Church of the Holy Light who had been able to hide his ties to the cult and secretly spread its influence throughout Stormwind. Not only would any aspiring cultists in Azjol-Nerub have difficulty learning how to wield the Void, but they wouldn't even know that there was an organization dedicated to hunting them. Krivax still had a few doubts about the necessity, but the Order's success spoke for itself. "As for why the Order does not recruit outside of the Vizier caste," Vizier Haedix continued, "there are a few different reasons, and the first is one of tradition. The Order was formed by the students of Vizier Kalchut, and that tradition of viziers recruiting either from their divisions or from their personal students has continued ever since." Krivax did not miss the pointed look that Haedix threw his way, but the vizier continued without commenting on the obvious implication. "The second reason is one of practicality. Over its long history, the Order has managed to form its own methods of protecting its members from the Void's corruption that rely on the active use of arcane magic, something viziers are best suited to using due to our makeup. Complete protection against the Void is impossible to the best of our knowledge, but as weak as these methods might be, any members of the Order who are not dedicated mages would be significantly more vulnerable to the Void." Krivax was not sure that he completely agreed with those justifications. While he understood the power that tradition could hold over an organization as old as the Order, he still felt that the benefit of recruiting the other castes would outweigh the risks. Vizier Haedix nodded in reluctant agreement when he said as much. "In truth, I suspect that many of the Order's leadership are simply reluctant to share the political power they have gathered over the years," said Vizier Haedix grudgingly. "There exists significant competition between the castes, and while what the Order does for our people is essential, no large organization is infallible." Krivax allowed himself to think over that for a moment before he decided to ask the question that had been on his mind since he understood that the vizier intended to recruit him. "Why me? Why now?" asked Krivax uncertainly. "Am I not too young and inexperienced to be recruited to an organization like this? Even if I'm going to become a vizier soon, I'm still not exactly a powerful mage." "Why would the Order only seek to recruit powerful mages?" asked Vizier Haedix, his expression visibly confused. "Many of our most important members are administrators. We choose to recruit after making an evaluation of the Order's needs and the risk that the new member poses to its secrecy. If we only chose to recruit powerful mages, then our options would be vastly more limited. Krivax was glad that Nerebians could not blush as he pushed down his embarrassment. He had unconsciously associated the Order with the Council of Tirisfil, and assumed that like them they were also composed exclusively of powerful mages. In retrospect, it made sense that they would need members from many different backgrounds if they wanted to accomplish their goals. "Where do I fall on this evaluation?" asked Krivax. "At first, I had intended to wait a few decades as there was no particular need to induct you into the Order," said Vizier Hadix. "However, circumstances have changed with the discovery of the Eastern Kingdoms. The Order needs to search these new lands for the prisons of the other old gods, as well as evaluate whatever influence the Void might have over its inhabitants. Given that none of the other members of the expedition are members of the Order, your active assistance will significantly ease my efforts." "How could I help?" asked Krivax. He couldn't see how he could do anything that the Vizier wasn't able to do himself. "If I wish to properly evaluate the Eastern Kingdoms, then much of my time will need to be spent away from the expedition. Simply assisting me in keeping my movements secret as well as remaining vigilant for the Void will make it much easier for me to accomplish my goals. Connect with the locals as you have done with the Tuskar to see if you cannot gather information from them that I can use while also working towards the betterment of our people. Anything that you can do to help the Order's overall mission while we are on foreign shores is why it is important that you do not remain ignorant. It is this need which has convinced me to bring you here today." "And what about the risk that I pose to the Order's secrecy?" asked Krivax, curious as to how the Vizier had evaluated him on the other metric that the organization used to decide on recruitment. "By that measurement, you rank poorly," said Vizier Hadix bluntly. "You lack subtlety and you fail to properly withhold information during your negotiations with the Tuskar. Still, the Order has many methods of keeping its secrets, and the risk you pose is manageable." With that said, Vizier Hadix said nothing more and simply waited patiently. After a few moments, Krivax understood that the Vizier was implicitly asking for his decision on whether or not he would join the Order. The answer seemed like a fairly obvious one, but he still took the time to think over the costs and benefits. The moment he had been teleported by his mentor to an isolated cavern that belonged to a secret organization, Krivax had been fully prepared to say whatever he needed to say to make it out in one piece. The fact that the secret organization was one that worked to fight against the Void simply made things easier for him. Vizier Hadix had done his best to paint the Order in as benevolent a light as possible, but Krivax was not naive enough to believe that he would like the results if he declined to join the organization. The only reasonable thing to do was to agree to join and hope for the best. After all, if the Order turned out to be an organization he didn't want to be a part of, he could always figure out a way to leave once it was safer to do so. With that decided, Krivax told the Vizier his answer. "You've made an excellent decision, Initiate Krivax," said Vizier Hadix, sounding immensely pleased with himself. "Normally I would introduce you to some of the Order's members, but you have an important day tomorrow. I will teleport you back to Killerhook so that you may inform your friend about your imminent elevation in caste. I am told that the process is a long one. We will have plenty of time to speak later about the Order and your duties as a member." Without wasting any time, Vizier Hadix began casting the spell that would take them back to the city. As Krivax disappeared from the cigarette in a flash of violet light, he couldn't help but feel nervous for his future. "I'm really starting to feel like I've gotten in over my head,"